The Eastern Front, which we hardly ever talk about in Britain, is much, much bigger than the one in France and Belgium. It's actually nearly 1,000 miles long by the time it's established at the beginning of 1915. We spend a lot of time talking about the Western Front in Britain, and that's understandable because for us it's a decisive front for the First World War. But it means that we ignore millions of men fighting in dozens of other countries across the globe. We really have to acknowledge the fact that the entire war started as a result of tensions in the Balkans. And for this reason, the Balkans sees the first shooting of the First World War. It's still July when the Austro-Hungarians begin shelling Belgrade. In September, Serbia is kind of pressured by her allies to launch an offensive against the Austro-Hungarians. It becomes known as the Battle of the Drina. It didn't go so well, so in the end, the Austro-Hungarians managed to push the Serbians back, but they couldn't get any further. The small Serbian army was exhausted by the end of it and running out of supplies and equipment. And when the Austro-Hungarians then stage a third invasion attempt in November, the Serbians lost Belgrade. But by December, the Allies have sent them what they needed, and the Serbians attack again and manage to take back their capital, which is hugely symbolic for them. But Serbia is too small to replace the amount of losses that they've already suffered in terms of their soldiers. Added to that, typhus is coming for them. The epidemic that started at the end of 1914 killed 150,000 Serbs. So that when you look at the amount of deaths in a war proportionate to the population, Serbia suffers perhaps more than any other nation in terms of people who died in the war. Lots of doctors and nurses had volunteered from Britain to go and work in Serbia. A lot of them women, because they had been told by the British War Office that they didn't want them. So they had gone somewhere where they could help. Margaret Neal Fraser was a famous lady golfer who went as a nurse. Louisa Jordan was another nurse from Glasgow, and also Elizabeth Ross, a doctor. All three of them became victims of the typhus epidemic at the end of 1914, trying to help the sick and wounded in Serbia. The Eastern Front, which we hardly ever talk about in Britain, is much, much bigger than the one in France and Belgium. It's actually nearly 1,000 miles long by the time it's established at the beginning of 1915. Russia had a plan when the war started, much like Germany had the Schlieffen Plan, which we hear lots about. And on the 17th of August, their armies invaded eastern Prussia. This is terrible for Germany because the area is so close to their capital, Berlin. The opposing armies met each other at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, and the Germans used railways very well to move their troops about and surprised the Russians, who were so badly beaten that one of their army commanders ended up shooting himself because he was so ashamed. The Germans effectively destroyed a whole Russian army, and 13 generals were captured, so it was humiliating for Russia. However, as bad as it was, they still hadn't absolutely kicked the Russians away from Eastern Prussia. So this was going to go on and on and on. But while the Russians were roundly beaten in East Prussia, when you went southeast to Galicia, they were also fighting Austro-Hungarian forces, and here they were much more successful. They forced their enemy out of Galicia altogether and captured the city of Lemberg, which is a huge prize. Nearly 500,000 Austro-Hungarians soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in action in this battle alone. So when you compare it to the scale of what's happening in the West, it's absolutely huge. The Russians also managed to advance 100 miles, which when you're talking about the First World War and you're talking about trenches and gains of a few yards, this is epic. The First World War really was a global conflict, and for that reason, we have to look at what happened in Africa. Britain's first shots of the First World War were actually fired by a black soldier in what is now Togo in West Africa. Imperialism is what makes the First World War a global conflict from the very beginning, because all of the European powers that have gone to war have possessions further afield, which is why we have to look at Africa. So they had kind of agreed before the war that in the event of a European war, they would just leave each other alone in Africa and not start meddling. But that goes out of the window. Like for the very first days of the war, they all decide they're going to ignore that, which means that fighting in Africa happens very, very quickly. You have fighting in West Africa from the very beginning, in South Africa, where the South African government volunteered to attack what is now Namibia, which was a German possession at the time. You have a lot of underhand dealings in North Africa, and actually more outright fighting in East Africa as well. And that's just in the opening weeks. You also have fighting in Asia. So Japan offered to join the Allies straight away. Japan had a lot of imperial ambitions, and the First World War, they saw it as a brilliant opportunity, because if they wanted to go out and take an empire before the First World War, they would have had to pick a fight with somebody. Now they don't have to. The war's already happening. They just need to try and pick the winning side again, so that they would be at the table at the end when the spoils were divided. Britain tries to kind of reduce this a bit and say, well, yes, we'd love to have you, but only if you do as you're told. And the Japanese say, absolutely not. So the Japanese declare war on Germany. And the principal thing that they want at the beginning of the war is a really important port called Tsingtao, which is in German hands and is part of Germany's tiny imperial empire. So the Japanese, as early as August and September 1914, are already orchestrating a way to try and take that from Germany. We always think of Australia and New Zealand in terms of their first fight being at Gallipoli, but it actually wasn't. As early as August 1914, both those countries volunteered to go out into the Pacific and try and take, again, tiny German holdings, but it wasn't so much taking the territory from them. It was the fact that in those territories were wireless masts and communications. And when you joined them all together, they gave Germany a ring of communications around the world. And what these countries were doing for Britain were taking out those communications so that German holdings couldn't speak to each other. So the New Zealanders go out to Samoa, and eventually the Germans there just surrender without firing a shot. So their flag is hauled down there and the wireless mast is blown up. And the Australians actually have to fight for German New Guinea, so Papua New Guinea is one island, but in the First World War in 1914, Papua is Australian and New Guinea is German. And obviously the Australians were quite like the whole thing. So they go out and they take that. Long before Gallipoli, you have 6 Australians killed and another 4 wounded, and just a tiny little fight again to take out a wireless mast and dismantle Germany's empire. So as the war goes on and fighting grinds to a halt on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, people begin looking for another way out. They start thinking about where could we open another front where we could actually win the war. And in hindsight, some of these ideas are ridiculous. In Britain, you have 2 camps. You have the Westerners who believe that, no, we shouldn't do this. We should concentrate everything we have, our limited resources, on winning the war where it matters. And that's the Western Front. But then you have the Easterners. So this group includes politicians like David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill as well, who think, no, let's go out and go in through a side door and try and defeat the enemy that way. They come up with some pretty mad ideas, including landing in the Baltic and landing and trying to invade Austria-Hungary. But the one that sticks, and it's still a mad idea and it was never going to work, is the idea of attacking the Dardanelles. So by now, Turkey has declared war. They declare war in November 1914. And Churchill's a huge, huge proponent of this plan because he's the civilian head of the Royal Navy at this point. And he thinks that they can go in and they can seize this strip of water that's about 60 miles long and goes from the Aegean Sea into the Sea of Marmara. And what it is a route into Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, which is the capital of the Turkish Empire. So he thinks that this is a brilliant idea. There aren't many men and many supplies to dedicate to this. So he says, well, let's just try and do it with the Navy. So we'll try and do it only by sailing ships up here and attacking from the water, which is what they do. So it's a combined force of British, French, even Russian ships as well try this in February 1915, but it fails. So the Turks have built forts all along this strip of coastline, and the Allies can't get through. On the 18th of March, 18 Allied ships try one last time to get through from the water alone without actually landing an army on this strip of land. And again, it fails. Lots of ships were damaged and sunk, including the Bouvet, which is a French ship, which basically explodes as well. So it's humiliating. In Turkey, they celebrate this day as a day of a great victory. The Allied governments, instead of deciding, well, that didn't work and that was a waste of resources, they go, okay, well, now we will land men on there and we'll fight on land. We'll land an army and we'll try and take the Dardanelles that way. It really wasn't a good plan, and it was never going to work. If you look at the topography, they thought they'd take it very quickly. They didn't have proper maps. They hadn't properly planned. They weren't landing enough men. But importantly as well, they completely underestimate the Turks. They think that because they're white troops, that they will be superior to the Turkish ethnicity troops that are guarding the Dardanelles. But what they're missing is the fact that these Turks are repelling an invader. They're highly motivated not to lose. And so what essentially happens is a huge 9-month campaign that's a colossal waste of life, supplies and equipment. And eventually the Allies just have to pack up and run away. And ironically, the most successful part of the entire campaign is the running away, because not a single man is lost. But it's a harsh lesson for Britain, because all of this has been for absolutely nothing. You also have new countries coming into the war as it progresses, which means that more fronts open up again. So let's look at Italy. So in May 1915, Italy officially revokes or takes back the Triple Alliance. And by the end of the month, they kind of set a date with the Allies saying, we promise we will declare war on this day and we will enter the war, and they do. And the Italian front is really unique in the First World War. So it's about 400 miles long, like the Western Front, but it stretches through. Some of it goes through really high mountains in the Alps. So you've got, instead of digging trenches in earth, they're digging them in ice, and you get some spectacular photos of being high up in the mountains. And even just getting supplies up there is really difficult. So there's a famous gun that's still sitting on top of a mountain in the Alps, because it took so much effort for people to drag it up there basically by hand, that when the war was over, nobody was going to waste time and effort bringing it back down again. So you can still go and see it. Conditions could also be really, really dangerous. So there's 1 month in 1916 where 10,000 men are killed, not by each other, but by avalanches. Another one of these new fronts that's very different to the Italian front is Romania. So until 1916, Romania had remained neutral. And the king of Romania, King Carol, very much, he was a Hohenzollern, he was a German, and he very much wanted to join the Central Powers. Unfortunately, he doesn't have enough influence, and all of his politicians would rather join the Allies. There's a really embarrassing moment where he gets up in a cabinet meeting and gives a speech trying to convince them all to see it from his point of view. And I think it's quite funny that he gives the speech in French, but he basically begs them to join the Germans in the war. And when he's finished talking, there's just a really embarrassed silence where everybody stares at the floor because they don't want to. The Allies are absolutely thrilled when in 1916 Romania finally joins in, because Romania has oil fields. So all of the petrol that the Germans have been buying and all of the fuel that they've been getting from Romania is now cut off to them, and it's now for the Allies. Also as well, we talked in a previous episode about the fact that Germany and Turkey had worked together building railways going through Turkey. Those lines to get to Turkey had to go through Romania. So they're now cut off as well. So you've got Turkey on one side, Germany on the other, and the railway lines connecting them is now severed basically, because Romania have joined the war on the side of the Allies. Things started really well for the Romanians. They overwhelmed Austro-Hungarian forces in the Battle of Transylvania, yes, where Dracula is from. This was part of Hungary at the time, but Romania really, really wanted it. By mid-September, however, the Germans send help, and at this point, the situation is completely flipped. It's also becoming clear that the Romanians have made a lot of mistakes. They've kind of gone out of the blocks way too fast without really thinking it through, and it catches up with them, and they suffer a humiliating defeat. They got so excited about taking Transylvania that they ignored the fact that the Bulgarians, who had joined the war on the side of Germany, had forces nearby, and that they were actually their enemy as well. Thank you for watching this episode. Join us for the next one, because we're going to be talking about something really interesting. We're going to be discussing how the war was fought. We're going to be looking at the myth of the lions led by donkeys and talking about who the people were that made decisions and why they made them, when they made them, and whether or not they were any good at their jobs.